check your investment account.
Right.
The little line on the chart just dipped a fraction of a percent.
Yeah.
Your logical brain knows this is completely normal.
Mm-hmm.
But your heart rate speeds up, your chest tightens, and suddenly you feel this overwhelming urge to sell everything and just get out.
Yeah.
This reaction isn't really about the math on the screen. It feels familiar because it's not actually about the market at all.
No, it's not.
It's an ancient survival mechanism kicking in, a threat response triggered by something buried deep underneath the numbers.
Exactly.
And, we so often pretend that when it comes to finance or business strategy or just dealing with professional pressure, we are these perfect biological calculators.
Right, like we're just machines.
Yeah, exactly. We assume that if we just have the right data, if we look at the right spreadsheet, we'll make the right choice. But the research we are diving into today completely dismantles that idea.
It really does. It shatters it.
We're looking at neuroscience, financial psychology, and somatic healing. And it all shows that your financial choices and your reactions to stress are being mediated by this ancient biological hardware. Hardware that honestly doesn't care about your spreadsheet.
No, it just cares about keeping you alive.
Right. So to really understand why a blinking red number on a screen can make us feel like we are in literal physical danger, we have to look at the hardware in the brain.
Yeah, we have to talk about the amygdala.
The amygdala.
Yeah.
Which some people might remember from high school biology.
Right, yeah. For those who just vaguely remember the name, the amygdala is this little almond-shaped cluster of tissue. It's located deep inside the medial temporal lobe of the brain.
We actually have two of them.
Right. We do, yeah. One in each hemisphere, sitting right near the hippocampus. And historically, neuroscience has basically understood the amygdala as the processing center for fear.
Like the brain's internal panic button.
Exactly. It processes trauma, fear, and what we universally call the fight or flight response.
So it's the thing that flooded our ancestors' bodies with adrenaline when they, heard a twig snap in the dark woods.
Yes. Which was incredibly useful for surviving actual physical predators. But a team of neuroscientists at Caltech, this included Benedetto De Martino, Colin Kammerer, and Ralph Adolphs, they wanted to see how this ancient hardware deals with a completely modern invention.
Money.
Money, right. They wanted to know, is the amygdala just about physical survival? Or is it literally physically responsible for our fear of financial loss?
And the way they structured this study is just fascinating to me. Because they didn't just, hook normal people up to an MRI machine and look at the screen.
No, they took a much more radical approach. They studied 2 specific patients who had an incredibly rare genetic condition.
And this condition did something super specific.
Yeah, it completely destroyed their amygdala. It just wiped them out. But the lesions only affected the fear center. The rest of their brains, their logic, their memory, their basic intelligence, all of that functioned entirely normally.
Wow. Finding patients with that exact localized damage has to be incredibly rare.
Oh, exceptionally rare. But for researchers, it is the ultimate control scenario. Because if you want to know what a cluster of neurons actually does, you just observe a human being who has to navigate the world without it.
That makes total sense. So they had these 2 patients, and they also brought in a group of healthy control subjects, right?
Right. People of the exact same age and education level. And they had them all participate in this experimental economics task. They just presented them with a series of simple coin flip gambles.
I love when behavioral economists use these games. It just totally exposes the gap between, what is mathematically logical and what we actually do as humans.
Oh, absolutely. So here is the first gamble they offered everyone. It's a 50-50 chance to win $20 or lose $5.
Okay, so just looking at that purely mathematically, the expected value dictates you should take that bet every single time.
Every single time. If you flip that coin 100 times, you are guaranteed to make a significant profit. The potential gain just completely outweighs the potential loss.
That's a total no-brainer.
Right. And as you'd expect, most of the healthy people, the control group, they accepted that gamble.
Easy money. But then the researchers changed the stakes.
Yes. The next gamble is a 50-50 chance to win $20 or lose $20.
And here is where our biological software really starts to override the math.
Oh, completely. Most healthy people reject the second gamble, even though the mathematical expected value is exactly 0.
Meaning, over time, you aren't actually going to lose or make money. It just zeroes out.
Exactly. But the psychological and physical pain of losing $20 feels so much more intense than the joy of winning $20.
Which is evolution, right? We are wired to protect whatever resources we already have.
Yeah, because losing resources historically meant starvation. Gaining extra resources just meant maybe a slightly better winter. So the brain weighs loss so much heavier than a gain.
Right. And that brings us to the third scenario, which is where things get really crazy. The third gamble is a 50-50 chance to win $20 or lose $15.
Let's just pause and run the numbers on that.
Okay, yeah. So you have a 50% chance of making $20 and a 50% chance of losing 15. Say I take
Okay.
that bet 100 times
Right. Statistically, you win 50 times, so that puts $1,000 in your pocket.
and I lose 50 times, meaning I give back $750,
Exactly. So you walk away with a guaranteed $250 profit.
which is basically free money.
Huh.
Any algorithmic trading bot would take that trade instantly because the net expected outcome is positive.
Yet most healthy people still reject it.
Wow.
The visceral fear of potentially losing that $15 completely overrides the rational mathematical reality that the bet is profitable.
That is wild.
It is, and this is the cornerstone of a concept in behavioral economics called loss aversion. Humans generally need the potential gain to be at least twice as large as the potential loss before they'll even consider taking the risk.
Right. But the Caltech study reveals something so profound about where that aversion actually lives. Because those two patients without functioning amygdalae,
Right, those two patients took the risky gambles far, far more often than the healthy controls.
the researchers actually noted that they exhibited zero monetary loss aversion.
Zero. It wasn't just reduced, the biological hesitation simply did not exist.
That completely changes how I think about financial caution. It means monetary loss aversion isn't just some intellectual philosophy you hold about money.
No, not at all. It's not a cognitive choice you're making in the prefrontal cortex. It is literally a biological reflex generated by the amygdala.
Which Colin Kammer, one of the researchers, explained, right?
Yeah, he explained that the amygdala is critical for triggering a sense of caution toward making gambles where you might lose. It acts almost exactly like it does in situations of general fear and anxiety.
I mean, think about what that means for daily life. When you open your retirement app and you see that the market has dropped, that tight feeling in your chest is not a metaphor.
No, it's very real. Your brain is processing that digital number on the screen with the exact same biological hardware it would use if an actual predator walked into your office.
That is terrifying.
Huh.
And this translates directly into how we manage businesses and teams, too. There's a paper from the International Journal of Humanities, Social Science and Management, the IJHSSM.
Right.
And they describe the amygdala as a neuronal tripod in business choice and managerial preference.
Yeah, that paper is fascinating. It outlines how the amygdala processes these subtle emotional cues that ultimately dictate how we perceive risk, reward, and uncertainty when we're making complex business strategies.
Because, I mean, a manager trying to allocate resources might firmly believe they are being purely analytical. They've got their spreadsheets, the market research, all the data points.
Right. They think they're being totally objective, but the IJHSSM research emphasizes that unseen emotional currents are heavily, heavily influencing those choices. And they actually divide those currents into two specific categories.
Integral emotions and incidental emotions.
Exactly.
I want to make sure we pull those apart clearly for people.
Yeah.
So integral emotions are the feelings that are directly caused by the choice itself.
Right.
For instance, if you are looking at a highly volatile investment opportunity, the anxiety you feel about that specific investment is an integral emotion. The fear is tied directly to the decision sitting right in front of you.
Yeah. And if you ultimately decide to take a safer, lower yield option simply because you are terrified of the risk of the higher yield option, your choice preference has been dictated by an integral emotion.
Because the emotion originates from the options themselves. It's relevant to the actual task.
Exactly. But incidental emotions, that is where our brains really start to sabotage us.
Yeah, incidental emotions are basically moods, feelings, or just states of physical arousal that you carry over from totally outside events.
Events that have absolutely nothing to do with the decision you are currently making.
The classic demonstration of this is the Johnson-Tversky study, right, from
Yeah.
1983.
Yes, such a brilliant study. They wanted to test if an entirely unrelated incidental mood could physically alter a person's ability to objectively assess risk.
So what do?
They brought participants into a room and just had them read newspaper articles. One group read articles specifically designed to elicit a positive, happy mood. The other group read articles detailing tragic events designed to make them feel sad.
Just normal morning reading,
Yeah,
completely unrelated to finance or statistics.
exactly. And after the reading phase, they asked all the participants to estimate the fatality rates for various common causes of death, things like heart disease or car accident.
Okay, but the objective reality of those fatality rates is fixed. The statistics are just what they are.
Right? The numbers don't change. But the participants who read the sad newspaper stories estimated the number of deaths to be significantly lower than those who read the happy stories.
I have to just pause on that because the implications are kind of staggering.
They really are.
Just reading a different newspaper article physically altered their brain's ability to calculate objective statistics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Think about what that actually means for someone listening to this right now. Let's say you have a highly stressful commute, or, you listen to a really depressing news podcast on the way to the office.
You are generating an incidental emotion.
Right. Your amygdala is carrying that state of heightened arousal right into the building. So when you sit down at 10 a.m. to assess the risk of a new marketing campaign or review a hiring decision, that morning commute is invisibly skewing your judgment.
It just completely compromises the economic assumption that humans act as perfectly rational agents. We're not rational at all.
Not even close. And another study by Lerner and colleagues took this even a step further. They looked at the specific emotional valence of anger versus sadness and how those states impact our goals.
Anger is so fascinating in this context because it's a negative emotion, obviously,
Right.
but it actually provides this false sense of agency. It makes people feel like they have total control and can foresee outcomes.
But simultaneously, it makes them incredibly impatient.
Yeah, the Lerner study demonstrated that angry or sad participants were willing to take 13 to 34% less money immediately just to avoid having to wait 3 months for a much larger guaranteed payout.
Which is huge. If we map that behavior onto corporate finance or personal investing, it is a devastating bias. The mere state of feeling angry makes an individual up to 34% more likely to sabotage their own long-term financial goals for an immediate, smaller payoff.
Which is get this narrow-minded concentration on immediate acquisition.
Exactly. The decision is entirely driven by the need to soothe a temporary emotional state, not by actual financial logic.
I picture the amygdala like an overzealous smoke detector in a kitchen.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, because its core function is to keep the house from burning down, which is great.
Very important.
But it can't tell the difference between a house fully engulfed in flames and a slightly charred piece of toast in the toaster. It just sounds the alarm at maximum volume for both.
It really does.
But wait, if the amygdala is just standard issue human hardware and we all have this internal smoke detector, why do I panic when the market dips 1%, while my coworker can sit through a massive recession and not even flinch?
That's the real question.
Right. Like, why is the sensitivity dial turned up to maximum for some people and barely registering for others?
Well, the biological hardware is standard issue. We all have an amygdala. But the software that calibrates the sensitivity of that hardware, that is written over time. And the coding begins very, very early in life.
Okay.
The reason our amygdalas have such wildly different reactions to financial risk isn't just genetics, it's a matter of history. We have to look at the architecture of financial trauma.
So we are moving from the biological hardware into the actual programming.
Yes.
Which brings us to this article we found from Gears magazine that explores the concept of money shadows.
Right. A money shadow is essentially the unconscious psychological and physiological imprint left by our earliest experiences with resources and financial stress.
The article gives this highly illustrative story about a man named Marcus to explain how this coding actually works.
Yeah, let's look at Marcus. Picture Marcus at 8 years old. He's sitting at the family kitchen table. His parents are fighting over money again. There are past due bills scattered all across the table. Voices are raised. Doors are slamming.
The ambient tension in the house is just suffocating.
Exactly. Now, an 8-year-old child has zero concept of a mortgage interest rate or revolving credit card debt or what the numbers on those bills actually signify.
Right, they don't know the math.
But children are master calibrators of emotional energy. Marcus doesn't absorb the math. He absorbs the fear. His developing nervous system learns a very specific equation. Money equals danger, unpredictability, and a literal threat to his safety.
That experience is literally wiring the neural pathways of his developing brain.
Yes. So fast forward a few decades. The article notes that Marcus is now a very successful adult. He has a high income, a diversified investment portfolio, a healthy savings account. Logically, on paper, he is entirely safe.
Well, whenever the stock market experiences just a routine correction, that exact same childhood fear resurfaces.
All right. His balance sheet evolved, but his nervous system did not. His amygdala still associates any financial fluctuation with the existential threat he felt at 8 years old sitting in that kitchen.
It's like his brain is trying to run a modern financial portfolio using an operating system from 30 years ago.
That's exactly what it's doing. And this aligns perfectly with the vast body of research on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
Right, ACEs, which encompass potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. Everything from abuse to household dysfunction, which includes chronic financial instability.
Yeah. The research shows that exposure to a highly unpredictable environment structurally shapes how a child's emotional regulation develops. When a child grows up in an environment where resources are scarce or moods are explosive, their brain adapts by developing a heightened, chronic sensitivity to uncertainty.
Because their daily survival literally depends on being hyper alert to shifting moods or subtle changes in their environment.
Exactly. They have to be vigilant.
And if you think about the modern financial system or just the fast-paced corporate environment, they are essentially massive uncertainty engines. They produce daily, hourly fluctuations.
And that is the core conflict. You are taking a brain that has been biologically wired by its childhood environment to view uncertainty as a mortal threat.
Right.
And you're placing it in a modern economic system where uncertainty is just a functional, everyday reality. It guarantees chronic stress.
Which a cross-cultural study out of Durham University provided some robust academic backing for. They looked at the long-term, lifelong effects of early life shocks.
Right, the Durham study focused specifically on individuals who had experienced the profound trauma of parental loss during childhood.
What do they find?
They found that adults who experience that massive early life destabilization are significantly less likely to participate in the stock market later in life.
Wow.
The researchers concluded that early life shocks severely reduce an individual's lifelong tolerance for financial risk. The trauma fundamentally alters their economic behavior. It dictates their choices decades after the event actually occurred.
And financial psychologists often point out that these early experiences solidify into what they call money scripts.
Yes, money scripts.
These are the deeply ingrained, unconscious behavioral patterns we just default to when we're stressed. And the clinical literature frequently categorizes these into 3 specific scripts formed by early financial trauma.
Right, so the first script is hypervigilance.
This is the person who hoards cash. They might keep excessive amounts of money in a checking account, just losing value to inflation, completely avoiding the stock market.
Yeah, to them, the normal, healthy volatility of a market feels like stepping into traffic. They view safety purely as absolute control and extreme conservatism.
Right. Now, the second pattern is the polar opposite, which is compulsive risk-taking.
Yes.
And this is the one that always trips me up. Because if you grew up with severe financial instability and the trauma of not having enough, why on earth would your adult money script involve chasing massive financial risk?
I know, it seems completely counterintuitive until you view it through the lens of nervous system regulation.
Okay, unpack that.
For some individuals, the intense emotional rush of high-risk speculative trading actually mirrors the chaotic instability they experienced growing up. Their nervous system became habituated to chaos.
Wow.
So a stable, slow-growth index fund feels incredibly uncomfortable and foreign to them because it doesn't produce the adrenaline they associate with normal life.
So they unconsciously recreate the high-stakes roller coaster of their childhood environment through chaotic, high-risk financial behavior.
Exactly. It feels familiar. And to a traumatized brain, familiar often feels safer than the unknown, even if the familiar is actively destructive.
We just gravitate toward what we know.
We do.
Which brings us to the third script. Avoidance.
Yes. Avoidance manifests as the classic freeze response. People operating on an avoidance script simply disengage from their financial reality.
They let the mail pile up unopened. They refuse to log into their bank accounts.
Right. They delay basic financial planning like setting up a 401k for years. They intellectually know they need to manage their money, but the sheer act of looking at the numbers triggers such a massive wave of anxiety that they become physically paralyzed.
You know, I have to be honest. Hearing this, part of me is resisting a little bit.
Okay, how so?
Because I know people who make terrible financial choices.
Yeah.
They rack up credit card debt on things they don't need, they refuse to budget, and it feels like a bit of a cop-out to say, well, my amygdala made me do it,
Right.
or I have a money script.
Right.
Where's the line between a biological trauma response And just, a plain old lack of personal discipline.
Yeah.
We throw the word trauma around so easily today to excuse bad habits.
It is a really vital distinction to make, and your pushback is entirely valid. The difference between a bad habit and a trauma response lies in the mechanics of the body's physiological reaction.
Okay.
When we discuss these money scripts in the context of trauma, we are not offering a psychological excuse to absolve people of responsibility. We are describing the physical mapping of the autonomic nervous system.
So it's physical, not just mental.
Exactly. For someone with genuine financial trauma, the act of looking at a fluctuating bank account triggers a literal flood of cortisol and adrenaline before the prefrontal cortex. The logical, disciplined, planning part of the brain even has a chance to analyze the data.
So it floods the system before you've even fully registered the number on the screen. By the time your logical brain comes online to say, hey, let's make a budget, your body's already preparing to sprint away from a predator.
Right. The amygdala fires, the heart rate spikes, the breath shortens. The person is launched into a literal fight, flight, or freeze state. It is an automatic biological adaptation formed when unpredictability once signaled real danger.
And you can't just discipline your way out of that.
No, you cannot simply willpower your way out of a cortisol flood. You have to actively address and regulate the nervous system first before the logical brain can even begin to do its job.
Well, if the trauma is literally stored in the body's stress response systems, then we can't solve our financial problems just by looking at a spreadsheet.
Definitely not. You cannot outmath a biological threat response.
We actually have to look at the physical body.
Yes. And this reality brings us to the fascinating work of Dana Stovern. She developed a framework she calls the 12 somatic money maps.
And the word somatic refers directly to the body.
Exactly. Her work explores the deep intersection of emotional intelligence, physical energy, bodily responses, and personal finance.
She draws a really sharp, necessary distinction between what she calls IQ money and EQ money.
Right. IQ money represents the traditional, logical, structural accounting side of finance. It is everything we are taught about money. Budgets, interest rates, profit and loss statements, compounding interest.
It's the language of an MBA program.
Yes. EQ money, conversely, represents emotional intelligence, the energetic relationship you hold with resources, and the actual physical bodily response you have to financial transactions.
And Stovern's core argument is that when we only use IQ money, which is, let's face it, exactly what our entire modern financial education system trains us to do, we're essentially amputating the emotional and physical reality of our choices.
We're ignoring half the equation.
Right. If you try to solve an EQ money panic attack with an IQ money spreadsheet, the spreadsheet will lose every single time.
Every time. She maps out how this works physically. Let's look at map number 4, which focuses entirely on the adrenal system and the vagal nerve.
Okay, so to understand this map, we need to understand the biology a bit. The vagus nerve is a massive primary component of the parasympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
It wanders from your brainstem, down through your neck, wrapping around your heart, your lungs, and extending deep into your digestive tract. It is the physical superhighway connecting your brain to your major organs.
And its primary job is to control our ability to relax, digest, and calm down. It acts as the brakes.
Right. The adrenal system, on the other hand, acts as the gas pedal, pumping out adrenaline and cortisol during moments of stress.
So Stovern explains that when financial uncertainty hits, if we haven't done the EQ money work to strengthen that vagal brake system, the body immediately defaults to the raw survival mechanisms.
And she categorizes these into 4 specific financial stress responses. Right?
Yes.
Financial fight, financial flight, financial freeze, and financial fawn. Okay, let's break those down. Financial fight is the aggressive response to a perceived threat. So that might look like getting intensely, irrationally angry at a spouse over a $20 purchase.
Right. Or, in the markets, it looks like revenge trading. Impulsively making aggressive, high-risk trades to, quote-unquote, beat the market after taking a loss. You are attacking the source of the anxiety.
Okay, that makes sense. And financial flight is the urge to run away.
Yeah.
That is the person liquidating their entire retirement portfolio at the absolute bottom of a market crash because they simply want the pain to stop.
Exactly. They are fleeing the source of the anxiety, regardless of the long-term cost.
And financial freeze is what we touched on earlier, the total paralysis.
Right.
Playing dead while the unpaid bills pile up on the counter.
Yes.
But financial fawn, hold on, fight, flight, and freeze make biological sense for a physical threat. But fawning is like rolling over to appease an attacker. How on earth does someone fawn over their 401k or their credit card debt?
It's a great question. Fawning is a complex trauma response. where an individual attempts to appease a threat to avoid conflict or harm. In a financial context, the threat is often the potential loss of a relationship or social standing.
Oh, interesting.
So financial fawning might look like constantly picking up the expensive dinner check when you secretly cannot afford it just to ensure everyone likes you.
Yeah.
Or it might involve continually loaning money to family members, even when it completely ruins your own financial stability, simply to keep the peace and avoid their anger.
Your financial boundaries completely collapse to ensure your emotional safety through compliance and appeasement.
Exactly. You bankrupt yourself to keep the predator happy.
That is an incredibly profound way to look at people-pleasing. It's totally biological.
Yeah.
Stovern also details map number 3, which he refers to as the chakra money map.
Right.
Now, I know the term chakra can sound a bit esoteric or woo-woo to some listeners, but Stovern is using it as a structural map of the energy centers in the body to describe a very real, very physical psychological cascade,
She introduces the concept of a chakra lock.
which describes how nervous system overwhelm actually happens. Because financial crises are rarely just one isolated pattern firing.
Right. No, rarely. Usually, a triggering event causes 3 to 5 significant emotional patterns to detonate simultaneously.
Right.
For example, let's say a surprise medical bill arrives in the mail. That single event triggers a fear of immediate scarcity. That fear of scarcity triggers a deeply buried memory of childhood poverty. That childhood memory triggers a deep sense of shame about not earning enough as an adult.
She calls it a perfect negative money storm.
And it happens in milliseconds. One trigger sets off an overlapping cascade of nervous system responses until they lock together. The body physically shuts down, the breathing becomes shallow, the mind spirals into catastrophic thinking, and you are completely overwhelmed by the interwoven weight of past trauma and present reality.
To break that lock, to stop that cascade, Stovern emphasizes map number 2, presence practice.
Yes,
She points out that our natural tendency when dealing with financial anxiety is to ghost ourselves.
we completely check out.
Right, because our chest or our stomach or our throat physically holds the pain and anxiety of that money storm, we simply vacate the premises. We dissociate, we scroll on our phones.
But her point is brutal and true. If you aren't physically and emotionally present in your own body when you are looking at your bank account, you cannot make a sound choice.
Because if the prefrontal cortex checks out, you are leaving the financial decision-making entirely to the panicked amygdala.
Exactly. So she argues that the actual healing of financial trauma begins with a very basic physical presence practice.
Meaning before you log into your accounts, you literally ground yourself.
Yes, you feel the physical sensation of your feet on the floor. You take deep breaths to physically stimulate that vagus nerve.
And the deep breathing tells the vagus nerve to release acetylcholine onto the heart, right? Which physically forces the heart rate to slow down.
Exactly. You are using biology to trick the amygdala into believing the financial threat has passed, and that allows your logical brain to come back online.
And that physical grounding leads to what she calls the reverse treasure hunt.
I love this concept.
Me too. She suggests that the solution to whatever financial mess you are in is usually hiding right in the center of the most vulnerable, uncomfortable, terrifying stink pot you've been avoiding.
Yes. The exact account you refuse to open, the conversation you refuse to have with your partner, the thing you want to look at the least is exactly where the answer is waiting.
Avoidance is the compass.
Exactly. The intense desire to look away is the exact indicator of where the unmetabolized trauma lies, and therefore, where the EQ money work needs to happen.
I think about it like this. Imagine your logical brain, your prefrontal cortex is the CEO of a manufacturing company.
Okay.
And your nervous system, your body, your emotions, that makes up the workforce down on the factory floor.
I see where this is going.
Right. So the CEO can sit up in their quiet corner office and write all the brilliant, flawless financial plans, budgets, and spreadsheets they want. That's the IQ money. But if the workforce down on the factory floor is traumatized, exhausted, terrified of the machinery, and essentially on strike, absolutely nothing is going to get built.
Nothing at all.
In fact, if the workforce is terrified enough, they won't just strike. They will actively sabotage the factory floor to stop the machines. And in your body, that sabotage is cortisol.
Wow. Yeah.
The CEO is yelling, "Buy the dip, stick to the budget." But the workforce has already pulled the fire alarm and locked the doors. The CEO's plan is completely worthless if the workforce isn't regulated and cared for.
That analogy perfectly highlights the necessity of integration. You cannot optimize the top level without securing the foundation.
Exactly.
And if we take that exact analogy and apply it to an actual literal company, we start to see the wider implications. So far, we've only been exploring how this inner biological conflict ruins individual choices.
Right, personal finance.
But what happens when you take these traumatized, dysregulated nervous systems and place them in leadership positions within a corporate environment? The effects don't stay isolated in one person's brain. They multiply and infect entire organizations.
Which brings us back to that IJHSSM paper. It examines the ripple effect of managerial stress. When a leader is experiencing chronic stress and their amygdala is hyperactive, it heavily impairs their managerial choice.
Yeah, it leads to impulsivity, deep cognitive bias, and frankly, terrible strategic planning.
But the most dangerous part isn't just the bad decisions, it's the contagion.
Yes, the psychological phenomenon formerly known as emotional contagion. When a manager is carrying unmetabolized stress or is constantly operating from a place of underlying fear and anxiety, that physiological state directly infects their subordinates.
Because humans are highly attuned to nonverbal physiological cues,
Right.
especially from those in power.
Exactly. We are wired to pick up on it. The manager's high cortisol levels and tense body language act like a virus, spreading low-grade panic throughout the entire team.
And the paper notes that this emotional contagion completely kills motivation. It sparks two massive organizational killers, absenteeism and presenteeism. Absenteeism is straightforward, right? The stress environment is so toxic that people simply call in sick to avoid the physical toll of being there.
Yeah. But presenteeism is much more insidious. Imagine a team sitting in an open-plan office. They are physically present. They are staring at their monitors.
But their nervous systems are so fried by the ambient stress of the manager that they produce absolutely nothing of value.
Exactly. They are caught in a freeze response right at their desks.
To understand why this happens, we have to look at how stress actually interacts with performance. Because the cultural conversation around stress often oversimplifies it.
Yeah, we tend to think all stress is bad. We must eliminate all stress.
Right. But a foundational concept in psychology called the Yerkes-Dodson law proves that isn't true at all.
Right, the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It looks like a standard bell curve.
Exactly. The law, which was actually developed over a century ago, states that performance actually improves with physiological or mental arousal.
And arousal is just another word for stress.
Right. You biologically require a certain amount of stress hormones to boost your focus, to enhance creativity, and to generate the motivation to act.
Because if you have zero stress, you aren't relaxed. You are likely lethargic, asleep, or completely apathetic.
So as the stress level goes up, your performance goes up. You are climbing the left side of that bell curve. You're getting dialed in.
You reach the peak of the curve, the zone of optimal arousal leading to optimal performance. But, and this is the crucial nuance, the shape and peak of that curve change drastically depending on the complexity of the task you are performing.
Okay, break that down for us.
For tasks that require raw physical stamina or sheer repetitive tenacity, your body can tolerate and actually benefit from incredibly high levels of arousal.
So if you are a runner pushing through the final mile of a marathon, or a warehouse worker moving boxes, high stress and high adrenaline directly translate to high performance. Your body is using the cortisol.
Exactly. But for complex, difficult, or unfamiliar cognitive tasks, which describes almost all modern knowledge work, the curve shifts.
Right.
You require significantly lower levels of arousal to maintain the deep concentration required for complex problem solving. If you are doing deep strategic planning, writing complex code, or building a nuanced financial model, too much stress will literally shut down the prefrontal cortex's ability to execute.
You hit the peak of the curve, and then you just slide right down the right side, falling off a cliff into total cognitive impairment and burnout.
Yes, and the IJHSSM paper maps out how the modern corporate environment creates a continuous toxic doom loop based on this exact curve.
It starts with high workloads and poor communication from leadership.
Right, that ambient uncertainty triggers the amygdala, pushing the manager past their optimal point of arousal.
And because the manager's amygdala is hijacked, their choice preference degrades. They lose the ability to see nuance. They start making poor strategic choices and unforced errors.
And because they are making errors, the project falls behind, and the stress increases even further. The anxiety just compounds.
This chronic, unyielding physiological load eventually breaks the physical body. The paper explicitly links this sustained amygdala activation to severe physical health outcomes.
Yeah, we're talking hypertension, diabetes, and even cardiovascular hemorrhages.
The body simply cannot sustain a permanent fight-or-flight response.
It's not built for it.
So this brings up the million-dollar question. If the Yerkes-Dodson curve proves that we need a certain amount of stress to perform at our peak,
Yeah.
how do we find that sweet spot?
Right.
How do we maintain the focus and the drive without accidentally slipping down the backside of the curve into total burnout and
Well,
taking our entire team down with us?
navigating that bell curve and preventing the ancient software of the amygdala from hijacking our modern lives is really the ultimate test of human resilience.
It is.
Which leads us to look at the outliers. How do some people endure massive financial or personal trauma, a devastating market crash, a personal bankruptcy, a brutal corporate firing, and emerge from it not just intact, but profoundly calm, steady, and more successful?
Because it's so easy to look at those people and think they are just genetically gifted.
Mm.
They're naturally ice cold. They just don't feel stressed the way the rest of us do.
We constantly romanticize calm under pressure. We assume it is an innate personality trait.
But an article from VGAP magazine exploring the neuroscience of resilience aggressively dismantles the myth of the naturally unshakable person.
Yeah, psychological research demonstrates that profound calm is rarely inherited. It is almost always earned.
Resilience isn't a fixed trait you were born with. It is a skill built precisely in the moments when your life completely goes sideways.
The specific psychological mechanism behind this transformation is known as post-traumatic growth, or PTG.
Okay, PTG.
Throughout this discussion, we have framed trauma as a negative anchor, something that dysregulates the nervous system. But when an individual survives a traumatic event and does the work to process it, their threat detection system actually recalibrates.
So going back to our smoke detector analogy,
Yes.
post-traumatic growth is the process of upgrading the cheap, overzealous smoke detector into a highly calibrated smart system. It finally learns the physiological difference between the house actually burning down and just a piece of burnt toast.
Exactly. The brain stops sounding the 5-alarm fire bell for a slightly difficult email or a 1% market dip.
For individuals who experience post-traumatic growth, the physical sensation of vulnerability fundamentally changes.
Yeah.
Discomfort stops being interpreted as an existential threat. It simply becomes neutral information.
Right. A rapid heartbeat or a sense of uncertainty is no longer a signal to panic. It is just data they can observe and use to navigate the complex situation in front of them.
But there is a massive caveat here, and it is vital we clarify this. Mere exposure to stress does not automatically make you stronger.
No, absolutely not.
We live in this hustle culture that loves to parrot the phrase, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But the clinical literature shows that is absolutely false.
It is so false. For people with highly dysregulated nervous systems, people who are already operating on the very edge of their stress tolerance, more pressure just makes them more fragile.
Throwing someone into the deep end doesn't teach them to swim if they are already drowning. Exposure itself is not automatically therapeutic.
That highlights the critical difference between merely enduring trauma and actually metabolizing it. You can survive a horrific event, but if you grit your teeth and just endure it, the physiological memory stays locked in your nervous system, ready to be triggered.
Right.
Growth requires a specific process psychologists call deliberate rumination. You have to actively do the deep cognitive, emotional, and somatic work to make meaning from the suffering.
Let's ground this in a real example. Imagine two different people who both experience a devastating, life-altering business bankruptcy. The objective mathematical event is exactly the same for both of them.
Okay. The first person processes the bankruptcy by vowing to never take a financial risk again. They hoard cash. They operate their subsequent businesses from a place of deep fear and hypervigilance, and they let the trauma completely dictate their future.
Right. They survived the event. They endured it.
But they did not metabolize it. The trauma is still driving the car.
Exactly. But the second person engages in deliberate rumination. They actively rebuild their relationship with risk. They look closely at what went wrong without letting the failure destroy their core self-worth.
They extract the painful lessons and use them to rebuild a smarter, more resilient financial life.
It is the exact same objective event, resulting in completely opposite life trajectories, entirely based on whether the individual chose to metabolize the experience.
However, there is a hidden, often unspoken cost to achieving this kind of growth. The article points out a profound truth about the individuals who reach this state of post-traumatic growth.
Oh, this part was so interesting.
The calm person rarely tells you why they are calm.
That is so true. They don't walk into a chaotic board meeting and announce, "I'm perfectly calm right now." because 10 years ago I survived a bankruptcy, an addiction, and a brutal divorce.
No.
They don't wear their trauma on their sleeve. They just sit there, projecting total, unshakable steadiness.
And because they project that rare, unshakable calm in a world full of dysregulated nervous systems, they often become what the article describes as a public utility.
A public utility. They become the designated shock absorber.
Exactly. They are the person that everyone else in the organization or the family immediately leans on when a crisis hits.
Their hard-won steadiness, which they bought at a tremendous personal cost through deliberate rumination, becomes a free resource that other people constantly draw from to soothe their own panic.
I think about the difference between enduring and metabolizing, like digestion. Enduring trauma without processing it is like swallowing a jagged rock.
Ouch.
Right. It just sits heavily in your stomach. It hurts you constantly. It provides absolutely zero nutritional value, and it weighs you down for years.
But metabolizing trauma, that's like eating actual complex food. Your body has to do the incredibly hard, uncomfortable work of breaking it down. It has to separate the useful nutrients from the toxic waste.
Yeah. But when that deliberate rumination is finally done, the body turns the experience into muscle and energy. The hardest experiences become the actual fuel for that unshakable calm.
It is profound physiological and psychological transformation. It takes the reactive, panicked, ancient hardware of the amygdala and integrates it into a wise, experienced, resilient system. You are no longer at the mercy of your biology.
No, you're not.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by looking closely at the exact hardware in our brains, the amygdala, and how the Caltech researchers proved it is the literal biological source of our financial loss aversion.
Right. And we explored how integral and incidental emotions, like the stress of a morning commute, can completely skew our objective ability to assess risk and make rational choices.
We then explored how the sensitivity of that hardware is programmed by our childhood money shadows. We discussed how adverse childhood experiences wire our developing nervous systems for hypervigilance, compulsive risk-taking, or total avoidance.
And we mapped this out using Dana Stovern's somatic work, recognizing that financial trauma lives physically in the adrenal system and the vagal nerve, causing us to fight, flee, freeze, or fawn when faced with a spreadsheet.
Then we scaled that physical reality up to the corporate level, examining how the Yerkes-Dodson curve dictates our cognitive performance under pressure, and how an unmetabolized manager infects entire teams through emotional contagion and presenteeism.
And finally, we looked at post-traumatic growth. The realization that by actively metabolizing our past through deliberate rumination, we can recalibrate our threat detection and achieve genuine, earned calm.
Because your financial behaviors and your workplace decisions aren't just a matter of willpower or being good at math. They're dictated by biology.
But by bringing emotional intelligence to your money, getting physically present to stimulate your vagus nerve, and doing the hard work of digesting your past, you can actually rewrite your financial code.
It is the ultimate shift from being a passive victim of your biology to becoming the active architect of your own resilience.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with one final thought. I want you to think about the gap between the values you broadcast to the world, the calm, rational person you claim to be on your resume, or the put-together persona you project on social media, and the values you actually practice when your amygdala is screaming and you are under intense, terrifying pressure.
That's the real test.
Every single one of us has a version of that gap somewhere in our lives that we haven't fully examined yet. So I'll leave you with this. If your bank account statements and your daily calendar were the only pieces of evidence used in a trial to determine what you truly value, what would the verdict be? And the next time you're staring at that investment screen and your heart rate speeds up and your chest gets tight, remember, it's not the market you're reacting to. It's just a ghost in the machine.